What's up, everybody? Welcome in to a post-holidays 2025 edition of SSPN. The last time that we talked to you guys and talked some Spurs was December 26th, Ethan. So it's been about 2 weeks since we talked last. There's been 6 Spurs games, and the Spurs are 3-3 in that 6-game stretch, still at 500. So as much as there are some things to dive into, some new storylines that we'll get into in today's episode, and of course break down this Bucks game that we've got going on later tonight, things do kind of sit the same here for the San Antonio Spurs, Ethan, which with once again an 18-18 500 record in the 9th spot in the Western Conference.
Yeah, still in a really good spot, considering our expectations coming into the season, Jude. And these are some solid teams that we played, with the exception of Brooklyn and then debatably Chicago. But Chicago was healthy. We were able to beat Denver on the road, but we lost at home. So it's kind of a perplexing 3-3 to be in the last 6 games. But like you said, definitely places that we can talk about as for areas of improvement, but not without positives at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. Want to give a shout out to all you guys in the comments already. Robert Ball, Cody Castillo, he says, "Good evening, gentlemen. How are you?" We're doing pretty good. We're ready to talk some Spurs. We got a game at 8:30. Rolando Candelas. Okay. Oh my God. I just butchered that so bad.
Candelas.
Candelas. There we go. Rolando Candelas answering his question 8:30 on ESPN or whenever this OKC Cavaliers game ends, because that might go a little bit after 8:30. So it might be more of like a 8:40, 8:45 start. But we've got a lot to get into before that. But the first thing that I want to jump into, Ethan, I know you kind of gave your thoughts on those last 3 games, on the Spurs going 3-3 in those last 6 games. But the one thing that has been consistent throughout all of those games is Victor Wembanyama's performance. You could say maybe that there's some efficiency things on some of those games. Like if you want to get real nitpicky and say, okay, he didn't have the best shooting night in that second game in the back-to-back against the Nuggets, but he still had 23 rebounds and 20 points on top of 4 blocks. I could go on and on down all of his box scores. The Minnesota game, he had 34 and 8 in that one, shot a bunch of threes. All of these games have been, it's just, again, the leveling up of Victor in year 2. And that's one thing I want to do going into 2025, Ethan, is just make sure to harp on that and not forget that as we talk about everything else around him. So what are your thoughts on what you've seen from him in just these last 6 games since we've talked, and just kind of his continued ascension in year 2?
Yeah, dude, it's been unbelievable. I mean, just the last 10 games alone, I have the stats in front of me: 30 points, 12 boards, 4 assists, 5 blocks on 49, 39, 85% shooting splits. That's almost 50-40-90 for a guy who's only 21 years old at this point in his career. He is clearly the heart and soul of the team, the franchise, not to use a bunch of, keyword phrases, but
Right.
it's clear when you watch the games. Like when he's off the floor, completely different team. And that's not a complete knock against Zach Collins and Charles Bassey specifically, but just like I think it's a negative for the team overall. Like we need to be able to have some cohesion and an identity when he's not on the floor. But when he's on the floor, it is, earth shattering what he's able to do both offensively and defensively. And if I were to just point out one negative, it would be the 3.7 turnovers a game. I know that's kind of to be expected from a young player, especially a guy with high usage percentage, such as he. And, his handle at times can get a little bit loosey goosey still. It's not quite as tight as it needs to be. He can over dribble, which leads to these turnovers.
Yeah.
I can live with that. It's the stuff down the stretch, and that's not exclusive to him. We'll get into it. But in that fourth quarter, come crunch time, where we're trying to lock up wins, him, as well as some of our veteran players too,
Yeah.
have a tendency to get lackadaisical, take their foot off the gas, and just play a little bit sloppy, especially in the half court offensive sets.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, with that last part that you talked about there. And that's kind of one of the talking points that we'll get into here in a second. But just when you talk about if there is one thing to criticize Victor for, when you talk about the over dribbling and maybe some turnovers there, I completely agree with that. The one thing that I'll just add for just a little bit of context there is because of his length, for lack of a better term, that also will kind of when you're dribbling the way he is with
Yeah,
the wingspan that he has, like there's a higher chance of,
for sure.
miss bobbling the ball around or fumbling the ball. And again, that ties into why what he's doing is so incredible, especially with the jump that we've seen on the perimeter this season. But I just wanted to throw that in there a little bit. But still, even with that, sometimes he is trying to be a little bit too Jamal Crawford fancy like, in a situation where like that or
Mhm.
late in the game like that, where you'd rather just have like a tight power dribble, in that type of situation. So I definitely get what you're getting at there. And that definitely has led to some late game turnovers. But like you said, also, it has not been just Victor. And so that's kind of the next thing that we wanted to get into before we dive into the rest of our roster breakdown, because as you guys can see in the title, that is also something that we have in the works for tonight's episode. But one of the things that just in the Spurs fandom, if you will, as of right now, over the last 6 games, Ethan, as much as honestly, I've been a little bit disconnected just because it's been real busy at work the past couple weeks. So I haven't been able to catch every game live or to even watch all of them full through. I've been able to catch bits and pieces, clips on YouTube, but in the Spurs ether, what it seems like is there's a lot of frustration with the late game execution. There was even a clip that came out that it was swirling around social media today from Victor Wembanyama's post-game press conference this Monday against the Chicago Bulls, where he was basically saying it feels like other teams have, multiple different sets of plans and we just have one. There were a lot of Spurs fans, wondering if that was him, maybe taking a shot at Mitch Johnson. Obviously, me and you are going to say, we don't believe that.
Mhm.
But when we say we don't believe that, we don't believe that that's him publicly like taking a shot at Mitch Johnson. But
Right.
it could be him saying also like, hey, there are some things that I'm kind of frustrated with game plan wise right now. Um, but regardless, the question that stemmed from was surrounded about the fourth quarter execution, the late game execution. I didn't get to watch this Bulls game full through, but what I do know about it is the Spurs had a 101 to 110 lead with about 5 minutes left and ended up losing the game 113 to 110. And listening to the broadcasters and watching the final 5-minute clip, they were also mentioning that was the first lead that the Bulls had had all game.
Right.
So that's something that like at that point, like that's on everybody. That's something that even with all of the asterisks, if you will, and the context that we want to keep in mind, with this still just being year 2 under Victor. Um, that's something still that at this point, this team would tell you like we need to pull out that game. That's a game that we need to win. And also going back, as much as we talk about the context, there's also Chris Paul a couple weeks ago in his post-game presser saying, hey, we're done with all the young guy stuff. So it's kind of a tough balance to kind of, reasonably manage, how you should feel in your head right now.
Right.
But also, like I said, there definitely have been some late game execution woes, as much as we've also seen some really good things like that win against the Nuggets, which was almost kind of a comeback win for us, as much as it was neck and neck. But then
Mhm.
also you go back to San Antonio the next night, you fight to overtime, and you kind of get worked in overtime, for lack of a better term. So again, it's ups and downs, it's peaks and valleys, but we definitely have seen some inconsistency, especially in these last couple games or last 6 games that we're talking about. Um, some late game execution woes that have led to losses. The Timberwolves, the Bulls, and that second game against the Nuggets, all very, very close games.
Yeah, I think the reason behind that is multi-layered. I mean, a lot of people will point to just like, the age of our star players and say that's the reason. And that's definitely part of it. And that's a narrative that they're trying to get out of. But I also think, there's still steps in the process, right? Like last year, we couldn't even execute plan A, right? And that's step one is just execute the primary game plan. We couldn't do that. This year, it feels like we are able to do that. But the step we haven't been able to take is when good teams make adjustments, we cannot adjust to those adjustments. And when we give up a little bit of momentum and other teams start to feel themselves and either they're at home and they start, feeling that
Yeah.
energy, or they're away and they start to feel the Spurs fans lose that energy. Teams are capitalizing on that. And that used to be us because we used to always
Yeah.
play from behind, and so we would get a little taste of, oh, okay, we have a little bit momentum here, and we would almost win games, and we were still bad enough to lose most of those games. But you understand the logic. And I think that's kind of happening to us as these teams are finally getting some momentum. They're executing on their adjustments. The Spurs are getting flustered. It's creating late game turnovers. And we also haven't found a consistent lineup,
Yeah.
that works every single night since everyone's come back from injuries to close out these games. Like I feel like it's changing a lot, especially in that fourth quarter. Um, and that's the next step for the Spurs. Now, what's the answer to fix that? I don't know. It could just be a maturity thing. It could be, maybe we need Coach Pop back. Maybe his leadership is really
Yeah.
more of an absence than we had given it credit for. Not no disrespect to Mitch Johnson, but Pop has a different aura about him and has done it for so long that maybe it's a simple fix for him. But it's also, I feel like, just right within where most people expected the Spurs to be. Jude, if I'm being completely honest. Like, had you told me right before game one of this season, Spurs are going to be in a lot of games and in the fourth quarter they're going to lose a lot because of execution, I would be like, yeah, totally. But are we going to be 500? I would see that as a win. And that's where we are right now. I just think it takes time and we can't skip steps to kind of grow in that area.
Yeah, I think that was very well said, Ethan. It's a tough balance because you're seeing Victor, who's like a, I mean, I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but I think it's reasonable to say he's the LeBron, like Kobe, Jordan level player, right?
Right.
And so, so you have that, and you're seeing the jump that he's having in year two,
Mhm.
right? And because of how good he is already at 20 years old, it feels like, okay, we need to just fix everything now because he's already doing enough. As much as, like you said, there's little things you can criticize here or there, maybe efficiency wise, take it. Shots missed and turnovers. That's really all you can criticize Victor on, though, still. And everything else is so incredible on top of his physical stature that just adds to everything that he does.
Mhm.
That obviously it more than makes up for all of those criticisms. But again, because of what he is, I think it just again it gives Spurs fans this type of sentiment. Jedi Tricks in the comments says Spurs need to hurry up and make some trades. Wemby needs his number two. And to be honest with you, for the past couple years, especially last year, because that was year one, but even beforehand, like before Victor, when we were doing this show and everybody was like, we need to go make some major trade, I was very much down for the rebuild, slow cook, develop, like again, it go through the draft, the Thunder Rockets type process, that essentially we are kind of following as of right now. But even with that being said, and even with me trying to stay even keeled and, be like, hey, let's just slow cook this thing. Let's not skip steps. Like you said, with how good Victor is playing, even you and I in the last episode we had said, hey, at the trade deadline, we'd at least like to upgrade the backup center position just to make the structure and the makeup of the roster,
Mhm.
more supportive of him for where the Spurs are at right now. Um, but again, it's kind of that dilemma because you'd like to the late game execution issues that are happening surrounding us are kind of from the younger players. You're not really seeing it as much from like a CP3 and a Harrison, and it feels like the Spurs have that some assets to make some moves to upgrade and get a player who would do that much more consistently. But again, it depends on the plan of the team as well. And I'm not just
Mhm.
trying to talk in circles here. But it's a very delicate and nuanced conversation. But I will
Mhm.
say that this season I understand people like asking and demanding for a trade, much more than I have in years past. Because what Victor's doing, if you had a certain championship cast around him, it would be one of the best teams in the West.
Mhm.
And I say all that. That's not me advocating for the Spurs to make a big trade, but that's just me understanding like people wanting to accelerate the timeline more now this season in year two.
1,000%. And I think it really, really doesn't help. And I know there's a lot of context, and we've gone into the
Yeah.
detail with Devin as a starter is kind of underperforming right now. In
Yeah.
10 games as a starter, he's shooting 15 points a game, 5 boards, which is great, but only shooting 40% from the field and 27% from three. And we know about his defensive rating that has slowly kind of, declined as the years have progressed, which is fine if he's going to be a really versatile, offensive weapon for us. But if he's going to struggle, suddenly everyone's losing faith in Devin Vassell, which
Yeah.
last year I would not have expected. And people have already lost faith in Keldon Johnson. So now we're clamoring, for a second star player next to Wemby. Because I feel like the average fan doesn't think that's Devin and they don't think that's Keldon. And if you're a really average fan or you're not watching avidly like we are, you're thinking, oh, Stephon Castle's a turnover machine. Let's trade him. He can't shoot. Let's trade him. Right? If you're just looking at box score. So I understand where they're coming from.
Throw that in for Jeremy too.
And for Jeremy. Yeah, he can't shoot. He's not an offensive scorer. Let's get rid of him. Because as great as Wemby is right now, I understand the notion that we can't not have a player also getting close to 20 points a game. Like that feels like a requirement. Like even on bad teams, guys can get 20 points a game because there's just no one else to score the ball.
Keldon.
Right? Keldon. He had 22 2 or 3 years ago. So we kind of need somebody to step up. And unfortunately, I think they have to step up a little faster than maybe, we would like to admit, because this is the modern day NBA. And as much as the Spurs have not done things the way that the rest of the league has, I feel like that's just kind of the trajectory that every team is following. You're seeing that in Miami a little bit. So it's just the nature of the beast. You and I think, are more, everyone calm down, relax. Like we're 500. That should be something that we're celebrating right now. But still, there are some negatives that we have to talk about. And I think not having a second star player is one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. The last episode when we did our roster breakdown, kind of going through all of the main rotation guys, and there still are some names that have rotation minutes that we'll go over in today's episode. One of the things that we asked about, from Devin, the main thing was just consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And you've seen a little bit of that when I was looking at the box scores. I want to say that like 4 out of the 6 were solid. And then there were 2 duds. Like, so we're still waiting on that. And those were in crucial games, where him making just a couple more shots in these close games that we were talking about really could have been the difference, and so again, you want to see an improvement in consistency there. But it's tough too, because he's 24, but you can say, oh, well, he's 24. There's no more of this young boy or, young guy talk like Chris Paul talked about. And there's also the contract that Devin's on right now, so you don't want to sit here and just continually make these excuses. But also, I think to say that the way that he's played over these last 6 games has been completely terrible is just devoid of context, because he's had some good games in there. He had a huge poster dunk on Michael Porter Jr. at the end of that Nuggets game. Even though they lost in the Minnesota Timberwolves game, that was 112-110. A big reason we were in that game was because he had a 20-point performance there. Now, again, there's also the games where he's 5 for 17 and we lose in a close game too. So that's I think Devin would even get on here and say that's unacceptable, at this point of his career. But again, man, it's just tough, because you want to keep all of, you want to look at it from a 360 degree view. You don't just want to be like, okay, hey, in these last 6 games, 24-year-old Devin Vassell has been inconsistent. In the second year with Victor Wembanyama, we need to just trade him immediately and get rid of this contract, which maybe in 3 years could look a lot better when he's had some more development. Now, in 3 years, if we're still having this conversation, probably before that point, I would be like, hey, let's trade this guy at this point. You know what I mean? Like 2 years from now, or even next season, if next season this is still the same conversation about Devin Vassell, then like, okay, I definitely would entertain that much more. But I'm not there yet. But I will say, again, going back to, because of the way that Victor's playing, man, I get why people are frustrated and criticizing some of these other guys that we have on big contracts, like a Devin Vassell or a Keldon Johnson. But another thing I'll say, the last thing to wrap it up, in our last episode, we really were kind of touching on Keldon, and we're like, hey, pause. We were really kind of talking about how, his performance had been frustrating. There were a couple single digit games, scoring wise in there right around Christmas when we talked about him. And since then, nothing, like out of the blue all-star level, but I believe in every game since then, he's had at least double digits, and he's had multiple games with around 15 and 16. And that's kind of what you asked for kind of earlier in the season when we were talking about him. So I do want to say that, because we were really rough on him the last episode, and he definitely has improved his play. Not to say it's perfect, not to say there's still things that he can improve on, especially with his contract and things that he should live up to with that contract. But I do think we've seen an improvement from Keldon. And to be honest with you, if I'm getting double digits from him, especially around that 15, 16 range, for the most part, I'm pretty happy with that. I would like a little bit more like rebounding wise, assist wise out of a $20 million player, but also with inflation, like a $20 million player is kind of the old like $15 million player. You know what I mean? So you got to kind of think of it that way too. But one last thing, I know I said that was the last thing, but just one final thing. And this is kind of the biggest point that I wanted to get at with this whole late game execution conversation. As much as, again, I get people's frustration because of how good Victor is playing. It kind of like you mentioned earlier, at the same time, like, if you would have told us going into this season in year 2 under Victor, we're still going to have some late game execution issues, that would make complete sense. I hate to simplify it that much, but it would make complete sense. The fact that we're at 500 at this point in the season, and we've been, 2 games ahead of 500 before we had these 2 losses a couple games ago, and we're in the play-in race. Yes, maybe a little bit of that is the 22-60 seasons that we've had the past 2 years, but also on just the trajectory for the Spurs development and improvement. As of right now, this is pretty on track for year 2.
I would say it might even be more so than on track. Like, I think just Wemby being so unbelievably great has propelled the timeline for most fans. Last couple things on Devin and Keldon.
Yeah.
For Keldon, I think we've only lost one game when he scored at least 15 points. I think the stat is like we're 14-1 when he scores 15 plus points in the game. So we, like you said, we need to get him around that 15 plus point mark in order to be successful on the bench. I also just hope that he can get his 3-point shot up because it's 25% over the last 10, 27.6% on the season. So that number needs to be at least 30%, Keldon, for me to be satisfied. If he gets to that, then I'm fine with his rebounding and assist numbers personally, because then at least he's spacing the floor. And for Devin Vassell, I think for the box score watching fan, the guys that are just looking at the statistics, like that's going to be their biggest complaint, is that he's only averaging 15 points a game right now, and on inefficient shooting. But for me, my biggest complaint is going to be just, it seems like he's lost a lot of chemistry with Wemby. Because at the end of last year, they were like a duo, and they were fiery, and it was really impressive to watch their pick and roll game, and Devin's playmaking was taking great strides. And this year, it seems to have taken a step back. And that's why people are asking for him to return to the bench, because he felt like he was better on the bench because he was more aggressive and he looked more comfortable. And now that he's in the starting lineup with the rest of the guys, he looks a little more unsure, and his efficiency dropped off. So I'm not so keen on returning him to the bench because I don't know what that would do to his confidence at this point. But I don't know where his chemistry went with Wemby, because that's definitely taken a drop.
Well, think about it this way. The main thing about their chemistry was the 2-man game with Devin as a ball handler. And as much as I saw that a little bit in the Nuggets tape where, late in the game, we'd put the ball in Devin's hands and he'd slow things down, that was kind of still just him setting up the set, if you will. But the bigger point that I was getting to, but the reason I mentioned that was him setting up the set is that didn't turn into a pick and roll, where last year that was basically our play almost every possession when both of those guys were healthy. But with Chris Paul being, in the starting lineup, I think that kind of takes away just a lot of the way that the offense is set up, because Chris Paul is kind of replacing him as the main ball handler in the 2-man game or the pick and roll game or the pick and pop game with Victor, which puts Devin off the ball more, which going into the season, I thought, was only going to just increase his catch and shoot opportunities. But that ties into the shooting percentage that you mentioned with him in the starting lineup. Again, it's you don't want to just sit here and make excuses the whole time, but the main thing that pops into my head when it comes to this chemistry thing that you're pointing at with Devin, not just fitting in like a glove into that starting lineup, is the injury stuff. And I know that that's something that's, been a conversation with him kind of throughout his entire career, as much as he's never had like a major injury. He's had little kind of knickknacks, here and there. And he had time, you could say, to readjust kind of going into the backup lineup. And with the minutes restriction and all of that stuff. And, there's other players who come off injuries and, it doesn't take them this long, to get back into rhythm. But I think, just kind of he's still finding his footing. You said he's only got 10 games with this starting lineup, correct?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's two new players on the floor. Like, it's a brand new starting lineup and it's with Chris Paul. Like, it's as much as, it seems like it would just be an easy insertion. It is kind of a very different role, now that I'm thinking about it as we talk about it, because last year he was that main ball handler in the 2-man game with Wemby, and it's just like a completely different thing this year. Does that make sense?
For sure. I still just think he needs to find a way to be more impactful offensively. Because, like, I think about Devin Booker in Phoenix. I know it's a different situation because they didn't have a dominant big like Wemby, but he didn't really drop off as a scorer and as an impactful offensive player when Chris Paul came to the team.
Yeah.
Even though his ball handling duties were limited when he joined the squad. So I completely agree with what you're saying. There's going to be a learning curve. It's going to take time, like everything else. But if he wants to stay in the good graces of the average fan, he's going to have to figure it out a lot sooner than maybe we're allowing him time.
And straight up, with the contract that he's on this year, I think it's fair to, ask that of him, at this point. And when I'm talking about that, I'm not saying that just means that, we should just wave off his 5 for 17 performance or whatever, in a close game. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. But I think, kind of like you said earlier, or when we talked about it at Christmas, like maybe around the All-Star break, just once we get like a solid sample size of games from Devin, that's when, like, okay, what if, say, in March, just theoretically for conversation, in March, it's the same situation with Devin. I'll come out here and say, like, okay, hey, this is now he's been consistently inconsistent. Like, this needs to change, straight up. And at that point, if that continues, and then, I mean, we'll see what happens in the offseason. Who knows at this point? But if that were to bleed into next season, it would, we'd have evidence at that point of, okay, he's a consistently inconsistent player. Because if you're going to say that what you've seen so far proves that, that's just devoid of context, because that's when he was like a super, a 19-year-old, like, getting spot minutes. You know what I mean? Like,
For sure.
So,
I can buy into that. But let's talk about Devin Vassell come March 1st.
Right. Very good point there, Ethan. ROP says, I don't think the Spurs are ahead of schedule. I think Victor is ahead of schedule. I can see what you're saying there for sure, ROP. He says that Julian has been the only guy from last year who has come along well. I think I would disagree with that on him being the only guy that has come along well, but I think that is also a great transition into our roster breakdown that we have in this episode, Ethan, because the one rotation guy that just gets forgot a little bit because he was a former two-way contract player for the Spurs is Julian Champagnie. And that's the first person that we're going to talk about here today on our roster breakdown. Let me go ahead and pull up Julian's profile here. So Julian Champagnie averaging 12 points per game, 4.6 boards, 1.3 assists, as well as 37.8%. So basically 38% from three and 43% from the field. Let me see how many shots Julian Champagnie is taking per game from three, because I am curious. Yes, this is the highest percentage of threes for Julian in his career, at 2.6 to 7 3-pointers a game. And he's at 37%, which is the highest of his career when he's actually been a consistent rotation player. There is the 40% from 2022, 2023, but that was with 15 games at the end of the season there. So, Ethan, what are your thoughts on Julian Champagnie this season so far, whether it's been his role in the starting lineup or off the bench?
He's been unbelievable. I think for the most part, Spurs fans had written him off as a floor spacer that can fill in the starting lineup just as that fifth option that his only job is to shoot threes. And for the most part, that's true, but he's done it so tremendously well. And his defense is great. And I think the comparison between him and 2012, 2013 Danny Green is finally coming true. He's about 6'8", 6'9", so he can guard basically 1 through 4, or 1 through 3, sometimes 4. He's switchable. He's versatile. He's shown me a lot more ability to put the ball on the floor. That's not his specialty, but he's more athletic than Danny Green, in my opinion. And in the last 10 games, he's been shooting 45% from 3, and in many ways has been one of the most consistent players for the Spurs. And when you want to talk about guys that just don't do anything wrong, aside from the one game where he sold like crazy, I don't remember which one it was, but he had like 3 turnovers by himself in like the final 3 minutes. That aside, he hasn't made any mistakes for the Spurs or caused any losses other than that one game. So I've been tremendously impressed. I'm gonna give him an A+ so far.
I think, in the sense that of what we expected from Champagnie coming into this season, I'm giving him an A+ too. I mean, even in the last game that we had where the Spurs, they still fell in that game. I want to say he had 18. No, okay. That was a different game. That's the Brooklyn game way back. I don't know why I was thinking that one. Maybe it was the Denver game down here with the 15 that I was thinking about. 3 for 6, 6 for 11. But regardless, what we expected from Champagnie coming into the season to now, I mean, look at this little stretch back here. And granted, this was a loss, but still 30, 12, 19, and 11 in 4 straight games there, and even the 12 before. So 5 straight double-digit games for Champagnie. If you would have told me at any point this season, I would have been like, okay, yeah, maybe that can happen off the bench. But him in the starting lineup, the way that he was able to fit in there, it just exceeded all of my expectations of what I would have thought preseason. So I'm with you on the A+. That is not us sitting here saying Julian Champagnie is an all-star. Although, he might be getting into Dom Barlow territory, Ethan, with the way he's been playing coming off this 2-way contract. Still, in his role, he really has starred. And that's whether it's been off the bench or in the starting lineup. Yes, there's some games here and there where, he may not shoot a bunch or may not have a great shooting night. But still, for the most part, the spacing that he provides, regardless of how he shoots, that's still always a factor, as well as effort and IQ on defense, as well as providing some rebounding chops as well. I feel like we've seen this season, with the length and height that he has. So really defensively and rebounding wise, those are the things that have really surprised me. But even the scoring spurts that we've seen, as much as they're mainly just catch and shoot threes, but we've seen some dunks and off the dribble stuff from Julian too. He's not completely a potato with the ball in his hands. So yeah,
on
man,
a really good contract too.
For sure. Robert Ball makes a great point down there. He says Julian definitely overplaying his contract. When you think about Julian Champagnie's contract, that just makes what he's brought to the team, even that more valuable.
And I just looked it up. The best regular season numbers for Danny Green with the Spurs was 2014-15 when he averaged 11.7 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, and shot 43% from the field. That is pretty darn close to what
That's
Julian
crazy.
Champagnie is currently averaging for the Spurs.
And I want to have a little bit of an asterisk there, just that it's a much higher scoring NBA, but still, I think that illustrates the point perfectly there. That really, he is one of these undrafted role guys that is now breaking out. This was like his true breakout season here in San Antonio.
Stay forever, Julian.
Yes, we're down for it, especially on this contract.
If he can do exactly what he's doing right now for the next 5 years, please, I'll take that.
Absolutely. But we're finished up with Julian there.
Yes.
Alrighty, let's move on to another guy who has gotten some minutes in the rotation for the Spurs, and that is Blake Wesley. Obviously, not as consistent minutes as Julian Champagnie, but out of the rest of the guys that we're going to talk about, well, actually, I'm realizing there's another name that's got more minutes than him that we're going to talk about today as well. But out of kind of the young guys that were draft picks, like a Malaki Branham or a CD Sissoko, Blake Wesley has gotten the most minutes out of that hodgepodge of guys. nothing crazy stats wise from Blake this season. But when his name has been called, there was that 8 point, 8 rebound, 8 point, 8 assist, 5 rebound game a couple games back, or a while back. Let me see. That would be on his recent games, I think. Okay, so not 5 rebounds, but 2 rebounds against the Portland Trailblazers in the win there when Tre Jones was hurt. Yeah. Anyways, what are your thoughts on Blake Wesley this season in the spots minutes and the decent performances that we've seen every once in a while?
Everybody that watches the channel knows that I am a big Blake Wesley supporter. I love what he brings to the team, especially defensively, getting after guys, picking people up full court, extremely athletic in the full court, pushes the pace, probably the second best, I guess, behind Chris Paul, because Chris Paul is, the greatest at doing that. But Blake Wesley, speed wise, is definitely the best on the team. Obviously, not without his deficiencies, especially offensively, but he's cleaned up a lot of the turnovers over the past couple of seasons. I wish he had more minutes to grade
Yeah.
Jude, because what I've seen, I've really been happy with, and not to just compare him to Tre Jones the entire time, but they're very similar numbers, despite Blake
Yeah.
having 5 less minutes per game on average. He actually has a higher field goal percentage and only 3% lower on his 3-point shot. He's 20% from
Wow.
three. Tre Jones is 23% from three. And Tre, in my opinion, has been not as great with the addition of Chris Paul. I don't think that's his fault. But when Chris Paul's
Mhm.
doing everything that Tre Jones does, but just better and with more minutes, Tre kind of gets lost. So
Yeah.
personally, I'd rather give some of those minutes to Blake Wesley, especially in the second half of the year, and just really see what he's able to provide offensively, and see if he's grown in any areas that we just haven't had the ability to see yet.
It kind of is a similar story to Devin in the sense that we don't really have enough consistent minutes on a sample size to give a full takeaway here. But what you hit on is kind of how I feel about Blake in the spot minutes that we have. That's why I brought up the 8-8 game against Portland. Like, that is Tre Jones to a T, and that's why you said not to completely just only compare him to Tre Jones, but that's kind of who he's competing with minutes with. And we even saw some sparing minutes with Blake Wesley at the 2 next to CP3 when Tre Jones was hurt. And personally, I think he kind of fits that role, as an off guard next to CP3 if they're going to do that for whatever reason, more than Tre Jones. We even saw some backdoor cuts, where Victor's dishing him passes earlier in the season. But with all of that being said, those are flashes. Over a significant period of time, we'd really be able to make a determination on that, because if he's doing that, every game over a span of 15, 20 games, right? I
Mm-hmm.
can feel more confident about him, being an 8-8 guy, not making a ton of mistakes, not making, taking shots that he doesn't need to, and just, playing hard defensively and passing the ball, and bringing energy and juice as a backup point guard off the bench, or technically kind of a combo guard ball handler with Stephon at times as well. That's really all I'm asking from him. But if he can do those type of things, I would say that he is ahead of Tre Jones. But again, we just don't have the sample size to for sure say that that's the case. But what I will say is, in the spot minutes we've seen from Blake, I think we've seen some good things this season.
I would agree.
Unfortunately, though, the other guard for the San Antonio Spurs that has been talked about in the comments a lot, Robert Ball says, sadly, we need to show Malaki the door. July 26th, and SSPN OG says, I see Blake staying due to his defense. Not really Malaki, though.
Mm.
Malaki Branham is the next person that we're going to talk about. And again, unfortunately, as much as I'm surprised his stats are where they at, like it feels like Blake would have, higher stats than Malaki just with how the season has gone. Obviously, Malaki is much more of a scorer anyway, but that's besides the point. The bigger point that I was getting at is that Malaki Branham, we cannot say the same for in the spot minutes that we've seen from him this season. And now it seems like he's kind of been faded out of the rotation. We did see him in the Los Angeles Clippers game where the Spurs won by blowout on the 31st, but that was his first game in 10 games. And in that other game, it was 3 minutes, when the game was over. Before that, 3 minutes when the game was over. The last time that he was really getting consistent minutes was the first 2 weeks of January, as you can see down there against Portland.
December.
And Sacramento, or excuse me, December. I'm sorry.
You're good.
We're in the first 2 weeks of January, in the first 2 weeks of December. So he has been phased out of the rotation at this point. What are your thoughts on Malaki Branham's 2024-2025?
I feel bad for Malaki because there's a log jam at guard suddenly that we didn't have when we drafted him. So had we not also drafted Blake Wesley, had we not gotten Stephon Castle, signed Chris Paul, he'd be in the rotation and he'd probably be playing better than he is right now. But when you take away consistent minutes, it's going to be difficult for him from the get-go because he's a rhythm scorer. That's what he does. He's a 3-level scorer. He's not a defender. He's not really a spot-up shooter. And that's what we're asking him to do in the spot minutes that he is getting. And so we're just not playing to his strengths. So I want to say that first. I think on a different team and a different role, he's definitely better statistically. But in the minutes that we have given him, and if his efficiency's been terrible defensively, we know he's not that guy. And there's just better players in front of him. I would give Blake minutes over him. I'd give Tre minutes over him. I would give Stephon Castle minutes over him. I'd give Julian Champagnie minutes over him. And I think that's just kind of where he's fallen in the Spurs rotation. And I think we have him basically for one more year, right? Before we have to extend him.
We did accept his player option for next year.
So we have him next year for sure. I think next year we could be without Tre Jones. We could be without Chris Paul. So maybe he gets minutes next year and is able to prove everybody wrong, and he becomes the sixth man that we think he is. But right now, grading him on this year, Jude, I'd have to give him a D, if not an F, because he's been unfortunately unplayable, given the role that we have ready for him, and the players in front of him.
Yeah, I was going to say, for some reason in my head, there was a 17-point Malaki game that stuck out, and that was on a Thursday in November against Portland.
I remember that.
But other than that, man, well, okay. So we did have some 15-point games early in the season that I forgot about.
I think.
Well, see,
that was
see, and down here, that's what I was thinking too when I first saw those. So, you had some flashes early in the year, but he has not had a double-digit scoring game since November 7th. So that kind of sums up everything that you said. We're not just saying this to completely crap on Malaki, but, when we're trying to analyze the Spurs roster and where the Spurs are at, this is kind of how we feel about where we're at with Malaki Branham. I mean, every time that he's out there, there's unfortunately some sort of defensive lapse, whether it's a one-on-one where he's just getting beat or somebody going past him on a backdoor that he didn't see, i.e. a missed rotation. And a lot of times there's turnovers offensively as well, or, poor shot IQ. When he's making his shots, like I said in those games earlier in the season, I don't mind it as much, but also, as you can see with the game log literally right in front of you, he has not been making his shots a lot. And so, yeah, at this point with Malaki, like you said, we might bring him back next year, on that last rookie contract piece as a depth piece. He's still 21 years old. Maybe there's, like you said, he can prove everybody wrong. We can have, a little inkling of hope. But, we may draft his replacement next year as well. Because we have multiple first round picks there, or, make some sort of move that replaces him also. But yeah, with where Malachi's at this year, I'm with you on the grade part. I would go with, I'll give him a D+ because of those games early in the year.
Well, I think unfortunately he's kind of pigeonholed. He's put himself in a place. Yes, he just doesn't fit the current roster. He could flourish somewhere, definitely. He's put himself in a place kind of similarly to like Lou Will or Jamal Crawford. Like, he's going to give up 10 to 15 points a game.
Yeah.
So he's going to have to get 17 to 20 and do it efficiently. Off the bench or in the starting lineup, it doesn't matter. But that's what he's going to have to do every single night. And with the Spurs, he's just been extremely inconsistent and inefficient. So we can't let him play, or he's just going to be a detriment to our lead.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just other guys that we can play off the bench that are better at this point, straight up. I mean, at this point, Stephon Castle is a rookie, has already surpassed him by leaps and bounds on top of Julian Champagnie and Blake Wesley that we were talking about. And Blake doesn't even get consistent minutes,
Right.
Anyways, we'll leave it there on Malaki. With all that being said, I hope Malaki Branham, turns into Lou Williams.
Me too.
I hope he watches this and he gets motivated and becomes a scoring guard off the bench for the Spurs. I would love that. All the hope that we saw out of Ohio State when he first got drafted. But with that being said, Ethan, there is one other person that there's still some other names that we're going to talk about even after this one, but there's one other rotation player that we missed last time, and that is Tre Jones. Tre Jones. See, this is what I'm saying. Like, Malachi's averaging more points than Tre Jones. That's so weird. It's all because of those games at the beginning of the season. But 3 points, 2 assists, and 2 rebounds, and 4 assists for Tre Jones. I don't really, as much as, there might be some criticisms that we have for Tre Jones this season, Ethan, I still don't think that the numbers properly tell the story for Tre Jones. What are your thoughts on him this year?
I think he's played solid as well. He hasn't been earth-shattering, and I think a lot of that is because he's getting dual minutes with Chris Paul. I don't understand that aspect of Mitch Johnson's rotations. I know it's good pace-wise to have 2 small point guards that can really push the tempo, but defensively it's tough to watch. And then Tre's not going to space the floor, and I'd rather Chris Paul be the floor general in this situation. So that's kind of put him in a weird spot. But I still think he passes the rock well. He's a good playmaker. He gets into the paint, kicks it out, pushes the pace, all the things that we talk about from a pure point guard perspective. And I don't think he's been terrible defensively, to be completely honest, but he's still shooting 23% from 3, which isn't great. And when you just compare him straight up to Blake, to me, that's the biggest negative for Tre, is the fact that I think Blake deserves those minutes over him, given his age, his potential, and just kind of statistically what they're bringing to the squad right now.
He's an upgrade defensively.
100%. And I know he's going to give up maybe one turnover more than Tre, and he's probably not going to get 1 or 2 of Tre's assists, right? Like,
he's not as great, of an orchestrator as Tre either.
He's going to push the pace, though, probably better than Tre. He's going to score probably better than Tre.
Yes.
And then the defensive aspect, I think, is just the one that you can't really put on a graph. But if you watch the game, it's just so clear.
Yeah. It's a big difference, honestly, when I think about it. But I understand why they've gone with Tre. As much as the lineup stuff, like you were talking about, people were asking about that earlier in the stream in the comments as well. There's some weird things I've seen from Mitch Johnson, but I think just considering the circumstances, I don't think he's done that bad, all things considered. Like, if you would have told me this is the situation with Greg Popovich as the head coach, as we talked about earlier in the episode, I would, if you would have told me that preseason, I would have felt pretty good with where we're at. So the fact that Mitch Johnson is managing that, like, I want to give him some credit here. But also, like, the lack of minutes for Stephon a couple games ago, the last time that we talked, kind of like you said, that double backup point guard lineup, like playing Tre Jones and CP3 at the same time. I don't really get that. That's why I said I feel like Blake fits better in that role as well, and the way that he moves off the ball. And there's some other things that I'm forgetting with Mitch Johnson. He'll do some weird lineup stuff. So, like, I get where y'all are coming from. I just feel like turnovers or, a lack of execution and half court offense have more to do with the Spurs losing than the lineup we're putting on the floor, if that makes sense.
It does. It does.
But just with my thoughts on Tre Jones here for this season, Um, Again, I get why we're playing him over Blake, just experience-wise,
For sure.
He's just a more experienced NBA player, 4 more years. But I think from what we've seen in the spot minutes that we've got from Blake, I would like to see more minutes from Blake. And I think that just shows, kind of I feel like this might we know what Tre Jones is at this point.
Mhm.
And I think Tre Jones surrounded by a cast on the bench that is kind of built with the sense knowing that he's the backup point guard, on like a championship type team. I think that he can flourish there. But I think the way that we've kind of got this guard log jam, like you were talking about with Malaki, with Stephon, and CP3 now, those are kind of our main two ball handlers on top of Wemby getting the ball.
Oh, yeah.
He's handling the ball a ton more as well. And that's without even mentioning Devin Vassell as well. It's a tough situation for Tre because on the box score, there's really not a ton of impact that he's going to have other than assists. But even then, Chris Paul is taking away, a ton of assists that he's had. And I don't need to go down that whole spiel, but just the guard log jam again, it's
Mhm.
kind of made him hard to evaluate as well. But I think my biggest takeaway from Tre Jones this season is I think we just know what he is at this point. Now that we're seeing the same thing, it's okay. He's 25. This is what Tre Jones is.
And he will be an unrestricted free agent this offseason. So the Spurs are definitely evaluating whether or not they want to
Yeah.
bring him back. So I think the rest of this year will be big for him in that regard, especially with the likely possibility that Chris Paul either retires or just goes to a different team next season.
Right. There's that too, because here's the thing. If he does that, maybe we want to bring Tre Jones back this year. Say we do give Blake Wesley, a lot of those, or next year, I mean, but say we do give Blake Wesley a lot of those minutes. And then a lot of the issues that we've seen from Blake in the past start popping up again. And, Tre Jones is willing to come back on an affordable contract and Stephon's the point guard next year. And Tre Jones, could be the backup point guard. But again, that's completely theoretical. You also have to take into account, the potential moves that we could make at the trade deadline, as well as who we pick in the draft, because maybe we could just be drafting our backup point guard replacement as well.
Who's that random Spanish guy that we drafted last year? That's a
Oh,
stat player.
Juan Nunez. He's
Juan
coming.
Nunez is coming, baby.
he's
Point guard room got to clear out. We got the GOAT on his way.
Speaking of the logjam, Juan Nunez is coming, baby. Juan Nunez, Don Barlow return.
Ooh, that would be a crazy two-man game.
Yes, on top of Drew Eubanks.
Oh boy,
and
the
Keldon and
Lob City
Champagnie.
2.0. Love it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, speaking of that though, Ethan, there's one more player we've got to talk about.
Okay,
Do you have any idea who this is?
one more player. CD Sissoko.
There you go. There you go. We're gonna talk about him. Not much to break down when it comes to his on-court performance for the NBA team of the San Antonio Spurs. His last G League game that he did have 30 points when he went down there with the Austin Spurs. But man, he's not playing in the G League as much this year. So this is somebody like, hey, CD Sissoko is on the Spurs roster. So let's talk about him.
Hey man, he hit 2 threes. He went 2 of 2 against Minnesota in that blowout loss on December 15th. Hell, man, I don't know. Maybe we should give CD Sissoko some minutes, if I'm being honest.
I wouldn't mind to see, just something.
Some backup four.
We will. Just like, well, actually, I was gonna say just like last year at the end of the season, we'll see it. But now that I think about
I don't know. We might be pushing for a play.
We're gonna exactly. We're gonna be in the play-in race, so we won't be doing that this year. So yeah, I don't know how much CD Sissoko we're gonna see, but I still like CD Sissoko's physical traits. If those can be honed, and pause again, right?
Again.
Yeah, but if those can be honed, the speed, the athleticism, if it can all be put together, he can really be like he has like a decently high ceiling. I think there is a path for him to be like a role player off the bench, tough defender, physical, barrel roll to the rim, 3-4.
He could absolutely be a more physical, athletically gifted Mamu.
Yeah.
Just bare minimum.
And we need rebounding help off the bench.
We do. I'd like to see him get some minutes, even if it's sparingly, especially in that bench rotation, because he is fun to watch. He pushes the pace. He's got a handle for a guy at his size. We talked about his Boris Diaw comparisons, just being
Mhm.
an in shape Boris that can also jump. To me, that's probably the best player ever built. Give me a Boris Diaw that can jump. Um, but like you said, I doubt it happens. And so far, it's been impossible to evaluate because he's played. I wish you could calculate how many minutes
And
he's
and
played.
there's like yes, like you have the handful of G League games, but it's not like he's playing consistently in the G League either. So it's just but I was like, we got to talk about him. He's on the team. We're going to go through everybody. We got to talk about CD. But like you mentioned as well, his handle, like he's got a skill set too. So, I think he's just still at 20 years old. He's just so raw that, we got to he needs another probably off season of development, and then
Mhm.
I don't know, but it may just turn out to where he never breaks into the rotation too.
If we drop to like 12 or
Like
13,
this.
he plays. Yeah, give Boris a chance. Come on,
Give
Boris,
my boy some minutes.
please. Yeah,
Let him go out there. Look, if somebody's in foul trouble, just send CD out there. He'll take care of it.
let
He'll
him guard Giannis tonight. Let
he'll
him get his
handle it.
6 fouls on
Yes.
Giannis.
No, I want CD Sissoko isolation versus Giannis tonight.
Oh,
French connection with Wemby. Uh, I'm trying to think of something French. Is it the baguette? Is that like the bread, the French bread?
correct. Yes.
Yeah. See, that's what I'm gonna eat after some CD Sissoko Victor lobs.
It would probably be really impressive, like no look lob from half court. Didn't he have a half court lob in his like 13 minutes that he's played total
Something
this year?
I
I'm
can't
pretty sure
remember.
he threw a
You're
half court
right.
lob,
You're
like a
right.
no look lob. Can't
Yeah,
remember to who though.
I can't either. Anyways, in all seriousness, though, as much as this gets into the kind of the part of the show where we start to joke around a lot, I would like to see some CD Sissoko minutes, and I think he genuinely does have some potential. Now, when I say some potential, I mean to like be a contributing role player.
I
Um,
agree.
but yeah, I don't think that he's just a total bench warmer like waste is I guess what I would put it. And I don't want to say that about any of our players or players in the NBA, but that's the
I
only way
want
that
names, Jude. Give me a
that's
comparison.
that's the best way that I could put it in that situation. But last thing, Robert Ball says, I'd like to give Minix some playing time.
Ooh,
Riley Minix for the Austin Spurs. Dom Barlow leaving just like broke my heart for the Austin Spurs. I just, I haven't been able to follow him as much. I just haven't had as much passion for it, Ethan. But when I have looked at the Austin Spurs, it seems like Riley Minix is getting 20 plus points every night down there in the G League and sniping most games too. So genuinely with the floor spacing as well as the size that Riley Minix brings in, I wouldn't mind seeing that at some point. But I say that, and then I just think about the whole conversation we had at the beginning of the game
yeah.
about how, or not the beginning of the game, the beginning of the stream about how everybody on the roster that we're criticizing, with execution. I'm like, would putting in Riley Minix would that help or hurt things, But I wouldn't mind seeing some spot minutes from Riley Minix as an off-ball shooter off the bench, especially with what we've seen from Champagnie. That should be his goal. Riley Minix should try to be the next Julian, and that's going to take a little bit.
Mm. Hey, man, everyone knows that I'm a big Riley Minix supporter, but I
That's
highly
true.
doubt that he touches the court,
Yeah.
especially if the Spurs are fighting for that play-in spot, which I hope that they are. But I will remind everyone that in the preseason, my boy dropped 8 points in 5 minutes on
That's
on
true.
100% from the field, and then he also dropped 7 points in 8 minutes, also or no, 40% from the field, so not as great. But I mean, he is a walking bucket, and he's a guy I think could eventually crack the rotation after a year or two. I mean, he is already 24,
Mhm.
so it would probably have to be next year if the Spurs are going to hold on to him. But he could be one of those undrafted diamonds in the rough that can come in and just be a floor spacer for us off the bench, or even maybe his ceiling's higher than that. And he could be our bench scorer because he does have those capabilities.
Look, he's got highlights on ESPN, Riley Minix with the and one bucket.
I think that's from preseason against the Jazz.
Yeah, exactly. 2 boards, baby. 2 boards. Look, Riley Minix is our age. He could be a co-host.
Let's get him on the pod. He's a TSR dupe. He does look like my guy TSR.
Yeah, there you go. He's his doppelganger. Oh my goodness. Okay. Just to wrap this up, because since we're going through Riley Minix, let's go through the rest. Harrison Ingram, from what I've seen, I'll just go real quick on this, Ethan, because I doubt you've probably seen much of these.
I have nothing. I got nothing.
Been a little bit of a transition for Harrison Ingram. Every time I look at the box score for the Austin Spurs, not the prettiest for him efficiency wise, but definitely, he's starting, fighting for boards. Just I think a transition for him from the college to the NBA game. So we'll see kind of what happens with him and his future moving forward, because he technically was our 2nd round pick from this season. And then the last person, David Duke Jr., a return, a 2-year tenured Spur, Ethan. David Duke Jr. Look, his last highlight is from when he's at Providence.
Oh.
Shout out to him, man. Still a Spur. His numbers are not as much as they were last year for the Austin Spurs, because it seems like Riley Minix is taking his shots away. But I'll just leave it at that with those guys. But there's our little two-way update, Ethan. And it's just so funny. I was thinking about it. Like the past 2 seasons, the two-way guys have actually been a genuine conversation. Like Bassie, Mamu, Champagnie, like those guys are actually now like on the team, and they were utilized much more throughout the season. And then this year, it's like you don't even hear a peep about him. And again, that's a testament to things completely changing. In year 2 with Victor. As much as there are struggles, the Spurs need to improve late game execution wise. There is a clock on a Keldon Johnson or a Devin Vassell. We're not just trying to sit here and make complete excuses for him, but also at the same time, you just got to keep everything else in mind as well. You don't want to get too overreactionary. If at the end of this season, we're still having the same conversation about Keldon and Devin, I'll be much more open to that conversation and receptive to it.
Agreed.
Any final thoughts, Ethan, on this? We went an hour. We didn't even talk about the Bucks game. Final thing, Bucks preview for tonight.
I'm going to take Milwaukee winning this game. I believe Chris Middleton has just been moved to the bench. I think he is going to probably flame our bench defense, Jude. That's going to be my prediction. I'm going to go 20+ points for Chris Middleton and a Bucks 10-point win at home against the Spurs. I still think Wemby's going to get his, and the showdown between him and Giannis will be entertaining. But we saw our bench defense against a guy like DeAndre Hunter for the Hawks. And my prediction for that game was the same, that DeAndre Hunter would be a problem. I think I said the Spurs would win that game, but I said he's going to be a problem. I'm going to say Chris Middleton's the problem this go around, but the Spurs lose.
Okay, well, I will. Jeremy Sohan is out tonight as well. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Okay, I'm not sure if he got hurt last game or what sort of.
He had that back tightness. Maybe that's just acting up again. I don't know.
I remember in the Clippers game, we won by blowout. He got taken out early in the game. But I'm not. Just to be honest, I'm not informed on that, but that is a key thing with Jeremy Sohan being out. I was actually going to say that we bounce back and get a win tonight on ESPN before I saw that. I think that just Jeremy being out, that's going to be
big.
That's a big thing on the interior, rebounding wise, fighting for boards, getting extra chances. And especially with the point that you made about Chris Middleton moving to the bench, I saw that as well. As much as we love our boy Champagnie and we gave him an A+, that is that's a big ask for him defensively. Same thing with Keldon. I mean, those are going to be the 2 guys guarding him off the bench. Not to say that it may be like, they can't force a handful of individual isolation stops, but I think for the most part, Chris Middleton will get his, like you said.
For the Spurs to have a chance, I think we need a big game from Keldon Johnson. And by big game, I mean like 20+ points from KJ off the bench. Really being aggressive, attacking the rim. I think Milwaukee's perimeter defense is solid. Doc Rivers' team, say what you will about Doc Rivers. I love making fun of him. They always have really solid defensive teams. So for us to win, I think we need KJ to be that second best option for us.
Yeah, same thing with Devin as well. You're going to need both of those. The two guys we talked about tonight, talking about inconsistency, this is a night where we need those guys to show up and, have 20-point performances. One thing I will say that could potentially make up for all of this is if Wemby just goes insane with like a 40-point game or something. That could maybe, minimize the need for the contribution a little bit from some of those guys, but still for the most part, we're going to need, 15 points at least from both of those guys tonight.
Agreed. Last
thing I'll say, July 26th makes a good point. Want to see our young gun Castle go at it with Dame. And that's another person who, with Steph's physicality as well. And even, we see him pop up on the boards sometimes too. I think Steph having a good game tonight is also a big key with Sohan out as well.
I'm going to swerve and bend a corner. Whoa.
LiAngelo Ball, Harrison Ingram replacement.
Hey, man, he can shoot.
Jello is we're going to sign Jello, and that's going to open the door for LaMelo. And then, well, that would be a little bit too much of a log jam. So we probably won't have, we won't have Lonzo because we have Stephon. But LeVar Pop replacement.
It'd be a very, very drastic shift in culture, but you know what? It's strong personality. Let's do it. I'm with it.
We need a big baller brand sponsorship. Replace the Frost
BBB instead of the Frost logo.
No long, and the new stadium is going to be the Big Baller Brand Center.
The Big Baller Arena.
Wemby will get out of his Nike contract to sign with LeVar. This is what the LiAngelo Ball rap lyrics have led me down.
That's what you got from I'm a swerve and hit the corner, or swerve and bend the corner. Whoa. I keep changing it to hit the corner for some reason.
For those of you guys who don't know what we're talking about, LiAngelo Ball dropped a new rap song, and it's pretty funny. So y'all should check that out.
G3 Jello, baby.
Y'all should check that out. We hope y'all have a great night. We hope you guys had a happy New Year's as well. And we hope that everything is going well so far for you in 2025. And we hope that things will only continue to get better for Spurs fans throughout this year, through the end of this season and the beginning of next season at the end of this year. So we appreciate you guys. Go Spurs, go. Let's hope that we can get a national TV dub, or at least, a competitive game tonight against Milwaukee in this Wemby versus Giannis rematch here. So again, we appreciate you guys. We'll catch y'all in the next one. Don't forget to hit that like and that subscribe button below if you enjoyed the content. If you want to stay updated with the show, follow us on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, at SSPN on YT, at Jude McLaren, and at Ethan_Quintero. We appreciate you guys hanging out with us. Go Spurs, go. And